Welcome to the Backstage Creative, the podcast that focuses on the people who work behind the scenes of theater. I am a musician. My name is Krista Copper. I hope all of you are doing well. I hope you're healthy and safe. This is June 2020, so we're still in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. So yeah, it's I miss working. I miss theater. I miss the magic. I miss it all, and so I'm hoping with all of you probably that we'll be able to get back to work, whatever that looks like. Who knows what it's going to look like in a few months. Speaking of which, my conversation today with Tilly Grimes starts off with her talking about the pandemic, and we talk about that for a while, and our speculations on what theater is going to look like in the next few months, in the next few years. So, like I said, today is my conversation with Tilly Grimes. She's a set and costume designer. She's great, and I know that you'll enjoy this conversation. I've been into the short introductions lately for these most recent episodes, so this episode will be no different. Here we go. Here's my conversation with Tilly Grimes.
Good. I mean, it's sort of, in some ways, it's like we're up with my in-laws, and it's in some ways incredibly lovely because it's so many trees and nature and space and, like, not Brooklyn apartments, and it's kind of pleasant to suddenly have more time and not be rushing around like a little headless chicken. And then you're like, right, but the world's ending.
Yeah.
And the industry is in this crazy free flow, and the economy is dying, and humans are dying, and that can't be good. So, all of that makes for a very rich and challenging landscape.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
We'll manage. I have great faith in the ability for humans to figure something out. Not that I might be a fan of what they figure out, but I'm certain they'll do something.
Yeah, I was thinking yesterday about, I was just worried about, okay, when are things in the arts going to start picking up? Like, even when the economy and restaurants open and all of that, I have a feeling the arts are going to kind of lag behind that. And I was concerned about it, but then I was thinking, like, there is no culture without art. Yeah, like somehow the arts will find a way to still happen, right? Because I think that as
Sure.
humans, we navigate towards art and we want to create, and it's kind of this, you can't have a culture. It's like you can't have a culture without language. Arts will find a
Sure.
way.
Yeah, and I think there is like a demographic of art that is like thriving in this, and people are, I think, taking it as an opportunity to make things and create things and try and find a way to reach out through the portals of Zoom and House Party and FaceTime, and like, how do you make something? I think the thing that is like more concerning to me as I work in like a live art medium is
Mm-hmm.
like, how and when do we create congregation?
Mm-hmm.
I feel incredibly convinced that, like, we can't live without coming together. Like, I think if anything, this weird time is teaching us like how important it is to that we miss contact and being with people and doing something in a shared event, whether it's like at a concert with music that you're experiencing together, or sitting in an audience laughing or feeling something or being affected by it. Like, there's a communality, if that's a word, to that experience that I really think we thrive off and enjoy. And so I think that will come back. I think the challenge is, like, can it come back before there's a vaccine? I don't think so. Like, I think all of the conversations about we'll sit every other seat, or we'll be inside a little, we'll put screens up between, PVC or plastic perspex screens between chairs or whatever, is all going to be a bit nonsense. I just don't see a world where, like, it's worth having a live experience where you can't be an audience or a congregation of some kind. Like, I don't particularly come from a religious background, but I would imagine one of the things about being in a church congregation is that you're with people doing something together. And I think they suffer from the same thing. Like, it's how do we bring community back where we can gather? Um,
Yeah.
and I think, like, it will come back. The challenge is, how do we make it through to that point? And I think one of the hardest things is like, there doesn't seem to be a lot of information or a lot of clear messaging on like the steps to get there. And every country seems to have a different way to do it. And certainly different countries seem to be more eloquent or less eloquent, or more organized and disorganized about it. And anyway, that's my 2 cents on all of that nonsense.
Yeah, it's interesting to think, okay, what is May of 2021 going to look like?
Totally. I mean, I think like, we keep looking at all of our jobs went on suspension around March 13th, essentially, give or take a couple of days, and some are like, maybe we'll come back in August. And I keep being like, I don't see a world where if I was an audience member, I would feel comfortable being in a theatre with even 30 other people, 20 other people, let alone hundreds or thousands. So I think that's all a little overly ambitious. I don't see a world where we're really back able to congregate until 21 at the earliest. But, happy to be wrong about that.
Yeah.
Seems unlikely. I mean, I do think what's nice is like we're certainly, a lot of the projects I'm on have been excited to like make sure that we're ready to come back. So it doesn't feel like the work has entirely evaporated. It feels like things are in suspension, but there is a desire to like make sure that when we come back, there are projects that are right for our audiences. And like it's interesting to hear producers and directors and writers talk about what they think those projects will be, what the tone we'd want to experience as a congregation or as an audience might be, and like, do we want to laugh together? Will we want to cry together? Like, what is that event? I think is a really interesting conversation to be sort of knocking around. And then from a design perspective, like, what will that mean? And like, what will it mean to come back to a theatre industry that is in the middle of a recession? And how do we design into that as opposed to not? All unanswerable at the moment.
Yeah.
Just cheery stuff, Krista. Just really
Yeah.
cheery stuff.
Starting off on a light note.
Oh, well, we already started. I hadn't even thought of it yet. Oh, that's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah, I just sneakily push record on these. I don't have like a ready, set,
Oh, I
go
see.
type
Yeah,
thing.
right. Red button. That makes sense.
Yeah. Great. So take us through your background, where you're from, kind of how you got into theater and costumes, and how you got to where you are today.
Totally. So I'm third generation theatre, and I'm not sure if I knew there was another option. My folks are both actors, and my grandparents are musicians. And so I really don't think there was like, I don't think we knew anybody who had a real job. So I sort of grew up sitting, waiting through rehearsals, or sitting in techs, or sort of being lugged about, and sitting in restaurants after a preview, hearing everybody talk about it. And you'd also, my parents would be on stage, so they'd come off and they'd ask, "What do you think?" And so I think from a very early age, whether I liked it or not, you were sort of looking and responding to what a live thing that was being made was happening. And so I don't really know there was another option. And I think it sort of made sense to sort of land in the world of a designer, because I guess I grew up watching things so much and experiencing them and then reacting. And I think fundamentally, I would argue the role of a designer is to be a sort of agency of feedback. You're kind of outside eyes for the director, the writer, the producers. You're in the room consistently, but you're not so close to it that you can't have a fresh perspective. We were always like part-time on, anywhere from like 8 to 20 jobs. So you walk in the room and there's a newness to how you're seeing it. And like maybe what they've discovered yields new information, or you suddenly have a question and suddenly that leads to something else. So I've always loved that part of the conversation and the dramaturgy, for want of a better word, of like, what is it that we're making and how are we making it? And like, when you bring the audience in, all of our best laid intentions, how do they react to what the audience is experiencing? Are we on the right track? How do we calibrate it? How do you shift it? How do you make sure the experience and the narrative that we're trying to convey is doing what we want it to do? Or if it's not, what is it doing? And is that better? Or is that doing something more invigorating or whatever? So I love that part of it. And I guess I kind of fell into it. I sort of lugged around working every part of various theatre bits, being some stage management, doing some terrible acting, I'm sure, at a certain point. And I needed some money when I was at undergrad, and the costume design teacher needed someone to carry bags, and I was like, "Yeah, I can do that. No, no worries." Just kept working, and so it's very accidental, but weirdly appropriate and right, and I think is a really good fit for me. But I never had a driving desire to be a designer. It just sort of manifested accidentally. So far it's been pretty delightful. I mean, jobs have good moments and bad moments, but majoritively a really lovely experience.
Yeah. What do you think has kept you in the costume world?
Well, I do costumes and sets. Majoritively, I do costumes in America because I think when I first came over, I was a girl who wore clothes that were maybe slightly on the spectrum of fashion-ish. I mean, I say very lightly because I'm really not a fashiony person. And so I think you get a little typecast into something. And I think work here begets work. And there's very much, I think, a culture of people get to know you as something. So you get sort of pigeonholed a little bit into that. And luckily, I think, the more you work, the more you work. It's always the hardest thing to break in, I think, because once you get an opportunity, something comes out of it. You meet one person leads to another person. But the starting of something was difficult. And I accidentally went to grad school here. I don't think I would have gone to grad school here if I'd known what it was like. But the English system of grad school is you basically take like one or two classes a week or a few classes a week, and you were expected to kind of be a grown up having a full career at the same time or beginning and developing your career. And I thought that was the same thing here. And it turns out it's very different and it's a very full on, full time experience. And I didn't really anticipate that when I started out. I thought I'd be able to intern in places, assist some people, and take some classes on the side. And I'd get a visa, and I would, use that student visa as a way to see if this was the right fit for me. But because it was such a lot of commitment, I ended up diving into it, which was great, but very different than what I expected.
Hmm. I mean, obviously, there's similarities between designing for costumes and sets, but does that get hard to organize yourself? Like switching back and forth between designing between the two mediums?
No, I don't. I don't think so. I mean, a lot of our job is sort of managing multiple things at one time because, like I said, we're always part time on multiple projects. So you're always picking something up, moving it forward, handing it off, picking something up, moving it forward, handing it off. Whether it's like you finish a set of designs, submit them, and while they're submitted, you work on the next set of designs, or whatever way we all work it. And with scenery and costumes, to me, they're very similar brains. I mean, the practicality of how you draw them is different, and the practical questions of like how you deal with materials or the infrastructure of how it's being made are different. But I think the questions are the same. They center from like what are we making and what is the style of what we're making and what is the event. And with costumes you get into the nitty gritty of who are each of these individual beings and how do we want to find their nuance and their specificity and the reality they live in, whether it's heightened or very much jeans and t-shirts feel entirely undesigned production. And scenery, it's about figuring out what the container or the envelope for the event is, sort of placing the play up against it and rattling it about. I mean, I think in England you mostly do both. You mostly design the production, and then there's a separate lighting designer and sound designer. So to me, they very much go hand in hand. So I think even when I'm designing just the sets, I'm always thinking about like what the humans are, and it's always really exciting when you're working with somebody else and their brain presents an entirely different thing. I'm like, oh, I would never ever have gotten there. That's really fascinating how a different human finds a different way. And when I'm designing costumes and you see what the set is and the container is, you're like, oh, that's amazing. Again, would never have gotten there. What an interesting way to present this particular story in this context.
Hmm. How do you keep yourself organized? Like you said, a lot of times you have multiple projects going on. How do you keep yourself like physically organized with deadlines and changes and schedules?
I think I'm a bit of a fascist with the calendar. I mean, I'm really very structured. Not to sound wildly unfun about it, but I try and set myself very early deadlines to put some pressure on myself to get a bunch of work done early on, so I'm not backed into things. Because I'm a bit of a procrastinator, and a part of my process is hating the first thing I do and then changing it and finding a better thing. It's not always the case, but often I like the second idea better, or I like to at least get to the second idea and evaluate the second idea against the first idea. I try to set early deadlines and I try to always be touching every project, even if it's just checking in on the calendar or seeing where I am in relation to it. I try not to overbook my work because I think that's another thing that's incredibly challenging is it's hard to say no to projects, especially as you're growing a career. I'm still very early, I hope, in my career. And you don't want to say no to things because they're great opportunities to work with new people and new spaces and exciting plays or musicals. Sometimes opera, but less at the moment. So I think sometimes saying no is the hardest part of the job, but I also hate the idea that I would be compromising a production because I'm overextending myself. I feel like I've learned that lesson. I've been really disappointed in the work, and I'm trying to be really conscientious about signing up for things I can really show up for as like a collaborator in the room and be a part of the conversation and not just sort of churn it out because you can churn it out. I think there's a sort of a tendency here to sort of make, there's like a factory format to how we work in theatre and the sort of way it all works. And I think the challenge is how to not get oneself into being your own little factory, because I didn't really come into this to be a machine. And you want to kind of feel like you're meeting a director and a writer, and theirs is that what they're making is their baby, and it's this musical or this play, and it's really special and important. And the reasons you're joining the project, you want to feel really clear about so that you can show up and deliver for it.
Mm-hmm. I like what you said earlier about just getting the first idea out there and then going to the second idea. I think the first idea feels like it doesn't feel fully formed or not perfect, and so sometimes it's hard just to get that first idea out there. But I think I found once you just do something, then that clarity starts to come.
Totally. And sometimes it's like the best idea, right? Like sometimes it's you make something and your instincts were actually totally spot on, but I feel like I like to check the opposite and make sure that the opposite isn't yield something more. I mean, I'm talking about much more like high concept costumes as opposed to like there's very much a spectrum. We're specifically talking about costume design of like if you're dealing with real clothes that are of today that we know, or you're dealing with real clothes of a period that we all have an idea that we know it. Maybe we don't know exactly what it is, but we've maybe seen a movie or we've read Pride and Prejudice, or like we saw a painting once, but we have some visual familiarity to it. And then there's like the projects that are entirely created and you're figuring out what is fabric in this world, what are jeans in this world, what are suits in this world, what does it mean to be formal, what does it mean to be casual. And so they're very different conversations. A show that is about like making human beings on stage feel real and not designed is a much harder and much simpler conversation than inventing a world from zero. Some of the things I find most rewarding is when we can put real people on stage and them not feel produced, or them not feel like there's been an outside hand touching them. It is like challenging because you're trying to figure out how to disappear, and that is like an interesting navigation of like listening to what an actor's instincts are, knowing what the research is, knowing what the instincts of the director are, knowing what the instincts of the play are, and trying to calibrate them all and make sure they feel balanced and real in the context of the space, and that they're serving all the beats, but that nobody notices you. And then on the other hand, the other end of the spectrum, when you're creating a world from scratch, is you're going to be noticed, because the whole point is to create something that envelops the world, like either it's futuristic or it's sci-fi or it's some kind of heightened version of whatever. But you really have to be incredibly thorough and invested in the nuance of the rules of that world. And that's challenging because you're starting from scratch and from research, and you become the authority on it. But you also have to make sure that you're feeling really challenging your own set of rules and making sure they're the best ones going in.
When you're in a room with other designers, or you're chatting over a meal or a meeting or whatnot, how do you maintain good relationships with people, even if maybe you disagree with them, or you're all kind of struggling to get on the same page? How do you keep just a good vibe going, because you have to get the project done, and so how do you keep those relationships healthy?
Well, I think it depends on who's leading the project. Different teams have different characteristics. Like certain directors want a team that shows up and is outrageously honest, and that's the ask. Other people, it's actually like that's less important. What I need you to show up is ask the right questions and sit back. Like I feel like there's different room tones, so I try and figure out what the room tone is and like what the collaboration is asking for. Sometimes it's like come in and make these people look real and like ask an important question if it's there, but I try not to get in the way in those collaborations. Like if I have a question that feels like it's really heavy or it's really important, I'll speak up, but otherwise I trust that everyone else in the room is like working towards the same goals, and I just have to stay in my lane and deliver the thing that is being asked to be delivered. I think like there's the art of asking a question is something I'm constantly learning. how not to lead it, not to be like, I want us to get here, but how to genuinely be like, what are we thinking about this? Or what is the mileage in this? Or what are we exploring here? Like, how to find the way to ask a question without answering it, and also without getting ahead of it in yourself, or for me, getting ahead of it in myself, so that I'm really able to listen to what the response is from other people. I think that's something I'm constantly working on. There are sometimes I think in collaborations where like I'm hired for the job and I end up being the wrong person for it. And it's a first date that, I'm not the right fit. It's not that I'm a bad designer or they're bad directors or other designers, but people are trying new people out, and maybe it's not the right fit. And I don't think the show doesn't end up necessarily suffering, but you kind of know, oh, maybe, they're great and I love watching their work, but my taste isn't quite right, or like the way I go about it isn't necessarily perfect for the way they work or what have you. And I think that's all fair enough. We don't all gel with each other. And I think that's a part of like finding your, I think the American phrase is finding your tribe,
Mm-hmm.
finding the people that, you are excited to be in the room of, they like the way you ask questions, or they, even if they find it challenging, they like that, or they don't like, like just finding where you fit in the puzzle. And so I find I end up working with a core group of people a fair amount of times. And the more I work with them, the more I learn how to work with them and how to understand what they're saying, or like when they're finding frustration, how to hear that, and learning what to take out of it, and learning what their criticism is, learning what their feedback really is. I don't know, I guess what I'm trying to do in every collaboration, but I think it's a constant process. I think I'm often learning about how to show up and be a better collaborator. I don't think I've solved that one. I think that's an ongoing conversation.
That's what makes it fun, like never
Yeah. I
always
don't think
growing.
I'd like it to be, I don't think I'd want to have a static answer on that, And I love that every group is usually different, whether it's different because we're in a different space, or we're different because it's a different time, or it's new energy from here, or whatever's going on, or someone's having a really hard time because of what's happening with their family, or someone's having a great time because they just had a baby, or like whatever it is, right? Like there's always new information that's coming in and affecting the chemistry, and that's always really exciting.
Mm-hmm. You almost have to have a humility, going in with some ideas of your own, but then also being willing to hear other people, and like you said, not asking like leading questions, but not holding your ideas too closely or too preciously.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it depends often on the project. Like sometimes you read a piece and you've really strong instincts, and you meet the director and they have really strong instincts, and it's like, wow, God, that's so exciting. Never would have thought about it like that. And then other times those instincts match up completely. Other times you're like, wow, that is not a production I know how to. I'm not the right fit for it. Like you're great, and that's going to be cool, but I'm not the right person for it. It hasn't happened very often, but I think it happened once to me. But it was like really like one of my dearest friends, and it was like, I love what you're making there. I think that's going to be terrific. But like, this person who's another friend of ours is like the perfect person to do that. That should be where you should go. They should do it for you. But I think of that more when I think of scenic design. I think with costume design, it's a little bit more, or for me, it's a little bit more about, especially with real clothes and modern clothes, it's more about serving than it is about leading, and making sure that we're finding a way to make the people feel real. With something that is more costume heavy, less clothes heavy, I would trust my instincts more, and I think sort of not pitch harder, but lead more with what my instincts are, and then sort of react accordingly based on like what if it's feeling right or if it's not feeling right, or what the feedback is to it.
Mm-hmm. How did you develop those instincts?
I don't know. I think they're just who one is. um, we're all like these little blobs that absorb. Shall I say shit? Are we swearing? I have no idea. Anyway,
You
these
can
little
swear, go
blobs.
for it.
Great. With these little blobs that like absorb shit as we go through life, and so then when you read a piece, you kind of, it resonates in a level, and you go, oh, that button is twinkling. I feel this thing. I feel that thing, or it's leading me here, and then you start to kind of like all your little antennae from various stuff that you've been exposed to start sparking, and it's sort of something chemical happens, and you're like, oh, X, or it should be pink neon, or whatever it is, or it's whatever silliness that's happening. I mean, we just have been making this big video game musical that's like so fun and so costume heavy and is full of magic tricks and like kind of part superhero Marvel, part like World of Warcraft, and it's been part like Cirque du Soleil in a weird way. And it's been so fun to design because it's like my brother was a magician when I was a young kid and I used to be his assistant, and it's like figuring out the logic of the magic is like, oh, I remember magic tricks. I remember how we engineered magic tricks. Oh, we do it like this, that leads to this, and then so it triggers all of the inspirations I think you've accumulated over the years, and you spit stuff out, and maybe it's right and maybe it's loony. Sometimes loony's good, sometimes loony's absolutely a terrible idea, but like you want to be in a collaboration, and I think often one is very lucky to be in collaborations where everyone is accepting to hear the bad idea, and it's okay to be told, yeah, you're right, that is a rotten idea, and you go, yeah, okay, well, what does it lead to? Maybe it leads to a better idea. I think all of that is good fodder.
Yeah, like you never know, even if your idea is terrible, it may like spark an idea in someone else's mind, and then you'll get
Yeah, or
somewhere.
at least
That,
maybe we figure out what it isn't. Like sometimes learning what's
mm,
wrong gets everyone together on the same page, right? Like if we're like, what is it? Is it a baseball? No, it's not a baseball. Okay, great. Well, that now we sort of learn where it's not. Where is it? I find that that's kind of a useful process. It's really hard, I suppose, to talk about design in a nebulous way because it's like you're trying to like talk about it, but it's because it's not tangible examples. It feels kind of nebulous. I realize, which is really fascinating, is like I've never talked about work that isn't specific to a project, which is kind of really interesting because it's just a different way of it's a much more generalized combo, which is fab.
good. Where do you go for inspiration? Whether for, I mean, you can go any direction. How do you keep inspired and keep, the ideas coming?
I actually think it's really easy and really difficult in both ways. Like when one is overworked and running around and spent thin, it's really important to carve time to refill the tank because I I do think you can sort of get stuck into habits, right? Of like, this is where I go for this, and this is where I go for that. Oh, it's comedy. I'm going over to these stack of tricks that I know because I've developed these muscles from doing a bunch of comedies or whatever it is. And there's some like as I like I think like I've been working for 10 years now. God, that's bananas to say out loud. But like you develop some shorthands or some shortcuts or tricks to like solve certain problems. And there's also like if you take time to like go to the museum or go for a walk or stare at the tree or go see a weird art house, live music, whatever, it can sort of just like feed senses in a way that you don't anticipate, which I think is really useful. Otherwise, I think you get stuck in habits, and habits are great and they're helpful, but they also need to be challenged. I,
Hmm.
I mean, personally, I think the way I do it is to stop working and stop thinking. Our job is so much about, in a way, analytical thought that then leads to visuals. So there's a lot of brain work that goes on it, and I find the best way to feel fresh is to like do something that requires very little thinking and try and be out in nature or be with some art that isn't necessarily analytical grain but is just receptive. And somehow I think that can bring you back to the table feeling fresh. I think when I feel stale at work, going for a walk always helps, or having a nap. Those are kind of like my go-to refreshers. Like in terms of like specific artists that you come back to, I mean, as a costume designer, you're always reacting to the specificity of character and the specificity of like the genre or the time. There's certain research that I always gravitate to. Like there are certain 20th century photographers that I always enjoy, but I try not to come back to the same image multiple times because every time you come to it, you've got more baggage on it.
Mm.
So there's constant hunt to find new things, and not just things that you're finding on Google or Flickr or Instagram or tangible stuff that you can hold. I love old zines and I love old like handmade books that you find that are like ones off where people have photography in them where you're like, oh, this weird thing, that's not found anywhere else. But I also love a great Instagram hashtag search where you find some weird photos of Auntie Jessie or whatever. Like that stuff is also really fun to mine. And it's so led by the specificity of the project. Like last year I was researching video game illustrations and characters. I was researching like creating these sort of like Cirque du Soleil clowns for another project and fairy tales while doing like, Midwest America family dynamics while doing like the 70s and then doing the early 90s and then doing 17th century England. So that breadth in like 6 months is really fun because your brain is like constantly ping ponging between things and they all kind of inform each other because, history and narrative, they're kind of, there's cause and consequence between all of it. But it's really enjoyable to your brain to be sort of pushed in those directions at once. I think it's one of my favorite parts of the job is exploring all those different things simultaneously and trying to figure out what the humanity and the comedy or the tragedy or the delight is depending on the project in each of those.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, recently it's mainly been comedy or musical comedy.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like a big responsibility to be a designer.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I don't really know anything else. I think you just get very close to your role. And I think that's one of the interesting things about the podcast you're making. It's like, it's nice to explore how somebody else does their thing because you get so invested and so close to it. And hopefully, the more you do it, the more you refined you get, the more you challenge yourself, you get more refined, you push yourself over there, you decide you hate the way you're doing that. So you develop a new way to do it. Like that, I think, is the cycle of being an artist, I suppose, in a way. Or maybe not an artist, but somebody who's like practicing some form of like self-motivated, skill-based task, if we feel
Mm-hmm.
funny about the word artist.
As a designer, you're kind of like, in some instances, you have to be a leader, right? Like you're going into a costume shop and saying, here are the designs, and
Totally.
you're giving them to all these people, or going into a scene shop and saying, okay, here's the plan. How do you lead well?
Well, that presumes I do lead well. I like to think I do, but I'm not sure. Being English, I can fully own that. Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing is to, I think, have clarity on what you're asking for. And if you don't, I think it's important to own the questions. I am very lucky to have an associate I've worked with for I think 5 years now, and she is knows me too well probably, and is very attuned to the way I like things. So in that way, I'm very very spoiled. I've gotten to know her over a long period of time, and we've had a bunch of other people come and join the team in the last few years, and it's been really wonderful to be able to like grow the team and have more people helping. I think listening to them. I think it's important. When I was assisting and associating, I really liked having responsibility and having investment in the work. So I try really hard to make sure that everybody feels invested and like they have stakes in the game in various different ways. I mean, it depending who's working for me and what their skills or strengths are, I think it would be different. I love having input. I don't think anyone gets the final say, but I'm super excited for good ideas or questions. So I hope people feel heard. I'm not sure they always do, because I'm sure that's variable. Going into a costume shop is terrific, and you're working with such incredibly skilled artisans and craftspeople and drapers and stitchers. I mean, it's a complete gift to get to see how someone else would make something. And I love presenting pretty thoroughly how I would go about it and seeing how they would do it and then finding how to develop it. I don't feel overly prescriptive. Sometimes I have the best idea, but most of the time there's something that can be improved about it or something that can push it further. And I like working with someone to get to the right solution. I really enjoy that part of the process. I think it's also like a hard part of being a leader is knowing when to put one's foot down or to say no, or to say no, we have to go this way, or I disagree, this is the way we have to go, is also an important as is sort of supporting people and making sure they feel like they have a voice, as being able to sort of go, no, great, love that is a good idea, but we've got to go to the left is the way to go. So I try and do that. I'm not sure I'm always the most successful at it, but learning and growing, keep trying.
Well, I mean, part of the great thing about theater is the humanity, like sometimes actors miss lines or musicians play the wrong note. I mean, I think what's great about the live experience and the process of putting up a live experience is that it can be kind of messy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's messy. I also think it's like the whole point of going to experience a live event is like the liveness of it is the idea of like, what is going to happen? How does it happen? What does it feel like to feel like? It's very different to sit home and watch a movie on a screen than it is to even go to the movies and feel an audience around me and there's the irritating guy behind me crunching popcorn, or we're all, applauding together when Thanos gets killed, like, or we're all sitting together at Hamilton, like feeling the percussive nature of like the sound of it just hit us. Like there's a community in all of that that is exciting and enlivening and enriching. And
Mhm.
I think, from my understanding, being on stage, it's the same thing. I think as a designer, the exciting part of being in a live event is how do we watch it one night, evaluate it, and then challenge it to get better or tweak it. And I think the part of the preview process is the preview process and the research process and drawing process are like my two favorite bits. I mean, I love fittings, I love working with the shop, and I love working with actors. But the ability to, like, if you're making costumes on set, you put it on set, it looks pretty, it looks perfect in frame, and then you have no idea how it's going to come together. I mean, you have some idea, but like when it comes out at the end, you're like, oh, I would have made a different choice if they were going to go for that shot, but you have no ability to react to any of that. Once it's in, it's in. And I love that in theater you can constantly develop and refine something based off of like how an audience is receiving it, how it feels in the room, watching an audience react to it. Is the gag landing? How do we help the gag? How do we help the actor feel more supported or more beautiful or uglier if that's what we're serving, or more grotesque or sillier? Like, how do we support that is always like the best bit to me.
Mhm. How do you deal with just difficult situations like with actors? I've walked by costume shops and heard some very dramatic happenings going on during a fitting, or I've heard stories about actors.
I mean, clothes are emotional. Anyone who
Yeah.
has ever gone jean shopping in their life knows how emotional clothes are.
Uh-huh.
And so there's nothing wrong with that. Like, it's fair game. We're also asking actors or performers of any nature to get on stage, have feelings, be vulnerable in front of a lot of people. So, I guess coming from actors, I have a lot of sympathy and a lot of understanding for it. I think the things that I think can be challenging is like, how do you support somebody feeling confident? How do you hear their questions and then answer them, speak to them, get them to feel better, receive them, and change them? It's a much easier thing, I think, to do if we're making modern day clothing productions, because we all know how we feel good in things, we know how they want to look, and we can sort of work together to get comfortable. It's much harder when you're putting clothes on that are not normal for your body, and for example you're in a corset for the first time and you're like, I feel like I can't breathe, I feel restricted. Well, that is a part of this event. We have to meet this event. This is what we're occupying. There's some nature to this narrative that we have to get into. Or if
Mhm.
we're like doing some crazy practical dance thing that has to reveal, like, I think actors are very into joining you and figuring it out. Mostly, I mean, there are some people who are having a bad day, and you get it because you're in a fitting room and they have to be vulnerable, and you just get it. I mean, that's a part of art, right? Like, sometimes that just happens, and I don't think that there's anything wrong with that personally. I didn't sign up to work in an office, and you know, I'm sure offices have their own personal dynamics, but like, I think if you've got musicians and actors and writers, and we're being asked to make something that conveys feeling and emotion to other people, there's going to be moments where feelings and emotion happen, and that's all right by me. I think when actors have a hard time in a fitting, there's usually something going on there, and it's about figuring out how to help them. I don't think it's about just doing what they want. I think it really is about figuring out what is the real problem there and trying to navigate with them how to help support them feel better about what's happening, so they feel comfortable. It's never going to work if somebody doesn't feel comfortable. There's nothing worse than being in clothes you don't feel comfortable in is a horrible feeling. As if you've ever
Mhm.
been a bridesmaid, you'll know it's rotten. So like, do that 5, 6 shows a week in front of a bunch of people, and try and dance or sing or look sexy or have a feeling. It's icky. So there's some good stuff in that. I think when you're working with major celebrities, there's its own set of things there. They've been used to treated and respected in a certain way, and there's often various needs that come into play that you have to deal with on top of just what do they feel like in clothes. And I mean, I think it's an old cliche that costume designers are therapists, but I do think there is a bit of like therapy or therapy that happens through fitting sessions, for better or for worse. But I think it's
Hmm.
just about getting somebody to feel comfortable.
Hmm. That's a great attitude to have.
Well, some days that is easier than others, obviously, because no
Sure.
one's perfect.
Yeah. So you've mentioned you're from England. So I love to talk about like cultural differences. I mean, I've
Yeah.
worked in theaters pretty much like all across the United States. And so it's always interesting to walk into a theater in New Hampshire and then, walk into a theater in Kansas City and just the cultural differences. I mean, the art is similar, but so what are maybe some differences between just the different cultures that you've worked in?
Well, there's so many. I mean, I think even in America, theatre is very different from state to state. I mean,
Hmm.
I don't know this country awfully well. I'm terrible at geography, but it's very different going down to work in Houston than it is like working up in Connecticut. Like they feel very different to me, even though in some ways they're quite similar. I've spent most of my career working in America or Ireland. I haven't worked as much in England recently. I think there is an infrastructure in America, like there's kind of a forward factory system to the regional units and like the season and how it works, which isn't quite the same back home. We also like the infrastructure of not for profit here versus commercial theatre versus like what we have, which is state subsidized, is very different. In England, you design the set and the costumes as a unit. You sort of those things go together. And here again, they're separated out. So you do this, and this person does this. So there's like a compartmentalization to it almost. I don't know. Those would be my immediate observations. In Ireland, every production meeting I've ever had has pretty much been, if not at a pub, the bar of the theatre, or with some sort of beverage involved, which is very lovely after a long day of work. The tech schedule is very different, which again, I sort of love when we're not going to midnight. I'm not a huge fan of
Hmm.
the 10 out of 12s that go 12 to 12. I'd be happily home by 11 if I could be. So I think there's sort of infrastructure. I think majoritively it's infrastructure that is different. I think the way that people talk or see art, I think that's all pretty universal, even though there's like words that are different or like cultural things that are slightly different. There's less sarcasm here. There's more sarcasm back home. There's maybe more of a currency of like bluntness back home. Here, I think there's a little bit more like want it to be a little softened out, a little bit more managed. But I think that's all kind of good stuff and kind of fun.
Hmm. Hmm. Was any of that shocking to you, like in the beginning of your career? I don't know if there's like sometimes like miscommunication. You're like, oh, this is like a cultural difference that I'm missing, or
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel like it took. I like was not as polite as I should have been.
mm.
And I don't think I was trying to be rude. I'm sure people thought I was very rude, but I think it's just like a sort of bluntness or a straightforwardness that sort of learn, and you realize, oh, okay, that's not what I'm coming across, not how I think I'm coming across. That's really interesting. Okay. But I think most of that was in grad school. I think grad school I had like a very shift cultural learning curve. It was like, oh, okay, this is a job here. Interesting. Okay, cool. But it's been really good. I really like being in America because there's so much enthusiasm. Like that's something. It's I think the reason I stay working in the American theater more than anything is there's like back home that there was like a lot of naysaying. Like you'd be like, "What do you think of this?" Nah, don't like it. And in here, you kind of say, "What about this?" And everyone kind of goes, "Oh, that's interesting. Maybe, yeah, okay, yeah." And there's just like an upward inflection about it that I find really infectious and really fun and enthusiastic. It's like I'd rather have people who say, "Yeah, let's try it," than people who don't even give it a go. I love
Hmm.
that about America. I think that spirit's really infectious and invigorating.
Hmm. Yeah, I've never worked in a different country, but one day.
Oh yeah, for sure. But don't you find even as you go around America, there's like so many differences state to state?
Oh goodness, yes. I'm from Kansas, like the middle of the country, like very rural, very
Yeah,
casual. And then I did grad school in Connecticut, and that was
different.
so different. And it took me a
Yeah,
little bit to realize, like, oh, okay, I why do I feel uncomfortable? Okay, like there's some cultural things I need to pay attention to, and adapt to in order to kind of fit a little better into this. But
totally.
yeah.
And like just understanding where it's coming from is like, okay, so that's what you guys mean by that. Oh, interesting. Who
Hmm.
knew? For
um,
sure.
I heard about you from the Playbill put out a list 50 women to watch.
Right. I have no idea where I'm incredibly flattered and chuffed to be on it. I've loved working with Rachel Chavkin, who was on that board. I love working with Teresa Rebeck, who's on that board. Both of them are collaborators, I think, are just super smart and interesting and have such a lovely perspective on character and storytelling in the event of like going and being in an audience at a live thing. Always excited to see anything they're making and deeply chuffed to be up there as the costume designer. It was great. Like that week was a really fun week. We were in the theater teching this big video game musical. I got my first Broadway contract and I was on that list, and it was like a really great week. And then that week, the end of that week, the whole industry shut down.
Oh no.
And it was amazing because it was like, oh yeah, of course. My immediate thought was like, how hilarious! Like what a sort of nice career high, and then also completely groundbreaking end of world moment. It was quite
Yeah.
funny. Of course, have to happen like that. Of course.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep, I've definitely had moments like I just moved to Kansas City in August, and I'm starting to make connections and gigs are picking up, and then oh nope, everything is shut down for several months.
Totally. It's such a weird, we spoke about this earlier, but it's such just an unfathomable time. And, I think I have 3 projects on right now that are like preparing to be ready for sometime in 21. They're all pretty big shows, and that's really exciting. And it's lovely to have some work and have things to do and to be involved in. And it's really interesting to hear each of those creative teams talk about how they're all handling this. And the only thing about it that is at all reassuring is that we're all in it together, and
Hmm.
that globally we're even in it together. And I do trust fundamentally that we as a society will want to come back to the live art and the live form, to laugh together and to cry together and to sing together and dance together. And so, maybe it's a bit of patience. God knows how we will financially support ourselves through the patience, but I'm sure we'll figure a way out. Humans have survived so much worse, so we'll be all right.
Very true. So my last question I like to ask people is advice to young designers.
I don't know really. I'm not sure if I'm in a position to give any advice. It's a really hard life. I think it's really important to just acknowledge that. If you're lucky to have a financial safety net, that's brilliant. I've never had that, so I think it's been incredibly hard to hustle through it all and to figure out how to make ends meet. And not to sort of be a downer at the end of this lovely chat, but I think it's really important to think about the things that are important to you before you go into it. Like it's a life that has a lot of independence and a lot of freedom to it. And also, you're not in the same place very long. You're up here, you're moving there. So there's an inconsistency to it that you've got to kind of be excited about. And I think in a vague way, I always thought that was really appealing. I think living it is actually incredibly challenging. Some days really rewarding, also quite hard. I love my partner very much, and I wish one of the great things about Corona is we get to see each other the whole time. But during the year, otherwise, he's off directing somewhere, I'm off somewhere designing. Then we like find a window of time, and there's a lot of like management of like life other than work that goes into the job or just existing. I would say if you're excited about being a designer, I would have just a real practical think about the survival side of it, and then go for it. If you feel really into it and you're excited about it, go for it. Everybody you meet leads to more work. So the more you meet people, the more you try things, I think is how I've figured out how to sort of keep going, is one thing leads to another. But I do think like we don't talk about the challenge of the practical life as much as we do of like the fun, artistic, creative, collaborative side of it. And maybe that's because in the arts, a lot of people are independently wealthy and they don't have to. I'm totally jealous and think that sounds brilliant. And having never been a person who's lived that, I think it's really important to not be bogged down by money or paralyzed with it, but also to think about it realistically and make sure you feel game for it, because it is a fight and it is a challenge, and it can be brilliantly rewarding, but it is difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Not sure that's advice, but that's my waffle about that. I would say it's the grind, right? Like the amount of
Yeah.
work you have to do. This sort of analogy of a beautiful swan gliding above water, and you just don't see how fast the feet are going,
Mm-hmm.
and your feet have to go really fast. You've really got to hustle. So I think if you're, into that and up for that, go for it. Give it a go. Why not? But there's nothing wrong if you try it and you're like, to hell with this. This isn't right. This is a pain in the ass. Totally, go for it. Find something else, you know. But yeah, you just got to be in for the grind.
The music for the Backstage Creative was improvised and performed by Ian Leroy, and the logo was designed by Zach Rimbold.